If there's any really real big overall theme about what I worry about, really this technology is moving so fast and people and institutions are not going to change and grow as quickly. And that mismatch is a real danger.
Hey everyone, my name is Kyle Wallgren, and this is another episode of The Business of Education. Today, our guest comes with over 30 years experience, with the majority of that in AI, but he has spent that time at Lincoln Laboratories, one of the largest research groups of MIT, where he has led research surrounding AI and focuses on how AI can transform education. He brings a deep knowledge with how we can prepare for AI-driven future and how work is helping shape the way students and professionals learn today. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ka. I want to clarify I'm no longer affiliated with MIT, just in case I say something stupid. So.
Fair enough. It looks like you got to spend enough time there to learn and work on some exciting projects. But now you're doing some consulting work in education, deploying AI resources into education. Walk us through some of that, and then I'd love to talk to you about a little bit of your experience with your time at MIT.
Yeah, my work in education is sort of short-termed as a career path, but kind of long-termed with respect to the sort of disciplines that I was grounded on. So graduate school, I was involved in sort of the neuroscience and psychology of learning and also of teaching machines at the same time. So it's more from that sort of learning science background that I come. These days, I'm spending a lot of time really more focused. Initially, I was doing a lot of professional development, and that still happens, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot more people taking a step back, thinking about how to approach this in a more strategic way. There are now people earnestly, getting my services for curriculum development. No kidding. What do kids need to learn, and when do they need to learn it? And so that's really a great focus of my time. And related to that is a book that I'm writing about, for educators about what is AI and how does it work and why is this all important.
That's interesting. I had a conversation today with somebody else that uses AI around professional development, but they were based out of Germany. Where do you see AI really leading for the next couple years in education? And if you were to ask, which you may have done so already, where could teachers use AI the most? What's the common answer you're seeing or the common trend you're seeing in that aspect?
So in the AI in education, sort of educator use of AI, I think what's going to happen is I think we're already seeing a bit of a crumbling of the emotional reaction.
Mm-hmm.
A reaction, by the way, that's not unique to education. I mean, a lot of fields are kind of looking at this and getting concerned. But fundamentally, there's the human aspect of education isn't going anywhere, and so the real question is, how can AI help you when you aren't available to help the student? Okay, so that's one way that I think of it. And the second is, how can I just make my life easier? And that's really workload reduction. There's just something I can do so I can get these formative evaluations done in timely ways so kids get good feedback. And then the third, I think, is really the hardest, but I'm starting to see that happen, which is pedagogical change. What does this allow us to do differently? And I usually tell folks in my professional development, especially those at the administrative level, deal with the emotional issue first. It's real. It's one that not just the educators have, many students, and you need to be able to say to them, "We've got concerns about this technology too, but let's work through this together," as opposed to having emotional brick walls set up. So get through that emotional thing first, make sure they can speak, and then get to how can I help your problem, right? Not some imaginary problem that an AI company came up with, but
Mm-hmm.
what is it that's a pain in the neck for you right now that I can make 20% better? So
No,
start there, start little pieces.
that makes sense. Small steps. I think with, chat GPT and how it's pushed everything to the forefront, it's made AI a lot more on the tip of tongue for people over the last, say, 18 months. But you've been working with AI for over 35 years. This isn't new technology, so to speak. It's just new to the advancements that it's made recently. But even people have been using a form of AI, even with Netflix, the recommendation engines on how it's suggesting the shows that you want to watch. But prior to that, what was it 30 years ago? What was this was like early concept, LLMs and neural networks were just being discussed. Walk us through
Yeah, it was
that and the
actually the
excitement of that.
very beginning of neural networks. So I had I had the fortune of good timing in my life and career. I learned how to start programming computers as a senior in high school in 1981 because
Mm-hmm.
some teacher, right, got ahead of the curve. And then I went to graduate school. I ended up in an interdisciplinary field, which really hadn't existed prior to that point. I was in biomedical engineering, so you could do either biology or engineering before that, but why did they need them together? And I stumbled into AI, and I did so through the biological path. I started learning about brains. My PhD advisor was doing work related to mammalian visual system, and I started modeling these neural networks in the biology, and quickly found out that there are some computational ways of cool things that you can do with it too. So it was actually the very, very beginning of neural nets, just like I was fortunate enough to be really at the very, very beginning of PCs. Um, and what I learned by being able to look at both the human side of thinking and learning and the machine side is those core fundamental principles that really transcend whatever era of AI you're in. I mean, the fact is we can do a lot more now because we have greatly improved computing power, but the math techniques that are being used were invented in the 80s and 70s, and in some cases the 40s and 50s.
Oh, wow.
Um, so
Where did they
principles are
see
still similar.
LLMs and neural networks, 30 years ago? What did they think the capabilities of it were going to be? Was the idea behind the opportunity as big as it is today, or was it, just scraping the surface?
No, I don't think anybody really imagined what scaling up these things could do. It's a bit like, the Wright brothers with their, balsa wood airplane and now
Uh-huh.
imagining some supersonic transport, right? Like we had a balsa wood airplane. I could go into some of these networks and manually tweak the network if I wanted to. Now the scale of these things now are so big that they're brain-ish sizes in terms of, but back then, yeah, it was almost what you would do now in a normal educational progression. Like I was working on toy problems for today's AI engineers, right? But but back then, it also happened to be, and I think it still would be, a great teaching tool as to you do things at small scale and you learn about principles that apply to big scale.
Spending your time at MIT, it's kind of not kind of, it is cutting edge. You know what I mean? So you guys were on the forefront of this whole journey, it feels like. What are some of the things that you've learned that maybe haven't came about yet, aren't on the mainstream of opportunities that AI could possibly do? And what's something that scares you as well?
So I think a lot of the advances that people talk about, and certainly are the ones that I'm most hopeful about, are in the biosciences and medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was doing some consulting even before getting into education more fervently with biotech companies and drug development companies. And I can tell you, before ChatGPT, there was so much money in the community being spent to sort of manually create what they call knowledge graphs. They're basically just sort of associative networks of here's what we know. This molecule we know affects this molecule, and it's an assemblage of all this research from all these different places. It took oodles of money to do that. And now sort of it's already in
Right.
ChatGPT and these other models. So it's really making people think about completely different paradigms. And now you're going to have things like we'll call it a large genomic model or a large proteomic model. And researchers are going to be able to communicate in the language of biology to solve biology problems at a scale of complexity they couldn't before. So I'm excited about things like that.
I was watching a podcast. It was probably something to do with Kennedy, maybe. I can't remember, but yeah, I think it was his running mate, whatever her name was. And she was talking about the amount of data they have behind prescriptions and diseases, chronic diseases, and how AI could help assemble a more personalized prescription for individuals that would ultimately, hopefully, take away some of the negative reactions that some of these pharmaceuticals and stuff are doing. Do you
Yeah.
see that being
Yeah.
possible as well?
I do. Look, I think that the medicine and health benefits of AI may be substantial. I'll talk about the risks in a second because you did
Hmm.
ask about that.
Sure.
Um, but it's going to be delay. It's going to be delayed effect, and that's just because of the regulatory framework we have, right? I mean, we want it thoroughly tested in people before before you give it to the masses, and that process is really hard to speed up. Diseases take the amount of time they take to progress, and that fundamentally limits the speed of certain things you can do. So
Right.
what the tendency has been is to supplement that, or the attempt, I guess. The regulators are sort of negotiating this with companies as we speak, is to be able to get it so that you can do things like mine a whole bunch of existing health records in an anonymous way to learn about patterns of things, maybe subpopulations that are having a particularly hard time with the drug,
Hmm.
or or a regimen, and then you make sure you're designing the trial to help them. So sometimes it's that you can do better problem formulation by
Right.
going through lots of data, and sometimes it's because you can get a better solution.
One of the things that, and let's circle back and then I'll ask my next question. But I did bring up what are some of the things that scare you about AI, and then I want to circle back to um, analyzing data with it as well.
Well, I mean, the fundamental reason that I got into education and
Hmm.
switched sides of the fence, I guess you'd say, is I'm concerned that the real bottleneck on things like jobs and careers and how far AI intrudes into taking over human roles is not. Well, it's partly about how fast AI advances, but I'm pretty confident I know the answer to that one. There's going to continue to be really rapid advance.
Hmm.
What's going to make or break whether we as a society deal with it well is how good humans are, and in particular, how good they are at these, adaptable, durable 21st century skills that the education world strives for. And so a lot of why I got into this is really not so much that those goals are I mean, those are goals that the education community has had for a long time, but that the way school is structured is not going to allow us to get to teaching those skills very well.
Right.
And so that's really what I'm trying. If there's any really real big overall theme about what I worry about, is that people, really this technology is moving so fast, and people and institutions are not going to change and grow as quickly, and that
Yeah.
mismatch is a real danger.
I see that definitely being a problem. I have an ed tech company that focuses on literacy, so we try and align a learning curve with, or a learning path for the individual reader based off content growth and how that individual student reads and how they learn and areas that they're having troubles with. And that's my business, and that's why I do these podcasts, is so I can try and learn more about things that we're using and technologies that would help us, and talking to people like yourself. But we do see, one of the concerns that I have is how people program AI and how it ultimately could change history, or what we believe history to have been, with how people have programmed these LLMs. For example, we've seen a huge hiccup with Google when it launched, and people were asking for images of the founding fathers, and now all of a sudden they were, women of color, which just wasn't true. So from my fear is, how is AI going to change what history was, and how are we going to identify that? And the people training these models, how are they going to manipulate what they think 2,000 years from now really happened? Does that make sense?
I think it's a very valid concern, but I think that's also a training issue. Not
Right.
just, I think there's a tendency to say, the people developing these products have to do a better job in some way. They do. Okay.
Right.
I'm not disputing that. But what I think I'm sort of on a soapbox about these days is that when you operate an AI, I don't even call it a user, right? When you operate an AI,
Hmm.
you are continuing to teach it, right?
Yeah,
And
for sure.
so like, it's almost as if, the product's got this long-term memory, but you can override it by this other information you find more authoritative, like the front of mind stuff. And that's, I think, the key mentality that I'm not seeing from educators right now. So I'll see this in assessment and grading, for example. They'll
Right.
take a grading system, they'll chug their assignments through it. Maybe they'll give it a rubric, maybe they'll give it the assignment instructions, maybe not. And they'll see the answer and they'll say, well, that's not what I would have done, right? Well, that's not actually the way to use the tool,
Right.
right? The way to use the tool is to engineer it so that it aligns with what you want.
Correct.
That actually is a development role, and the principles of learning and teaching AI that developers use, not necessarily the coding and all of that, but like the high level concepts and meta principles about how to do that, they apply to that operator as well as they do to the developer. So I'm trying to really preach, look, if your AI is biased, right, here's what you can do about it.
And I've
Not
seen
just,
that.
not just Chicken Little, but here's what you can do.
And I've seen that in real time, and it's interesting. And if people who use Chat GPT a lot, just ask it a question around something that you talk to Chat GPT a bunch about. I'll give you an example. My company is called Edsoma. We teach kids how to read. When I do research for these podcasts, I use Chat GPT to find leaders in certain areas. Some of the questions I ask is, please help me find and research the top 10 literacy tools being used in America right now. Well, because I talk about Edsoma from a marketing aspect with Chat GPT all the time, Edsoma has found its way in these top lists
Mm-hmm.
of tools that being used. And I know based off of how many clients we have that obviously this isn't true, but it will take the information that you're putting into it consistently, and it can almost have like an ego boosting effect. So if you're ever having a bad day, go ask it a question about something you give it a lot of information about.
It's funny. I was just writing about this today. Again, I think the biggest thing in the next, let's say, the next year or two, is sort of the attitude with which we approach dealing with AI. But this attitude of AI as a collaborator is one that we have to be pretty careful with. Because
Mm-hmm.
as you said, it's really a sycophant a lot of times. It's going to tell you, this is great, you're wise and wonderful, and
Yeah.
I would have not thought of that, right? But it's because it's trying to align with what it thinks you want it to do, right? And I always say, when I'm teaching about prompting, for example, like if you give a prompt that's as wide as the whole wall, it's going to, whatever it puts out is going to, in terms of the constraints you put on it, whatever the AI puts out fits those constraints, right? If the whole wall's a dartboard, I'm gonna get a bullseye. So,
Right.
um, and so the key is really to give it, you know, to control it, and it's more like treating it as a servant than a collaborator. Um, and even if you're trying to innovate and brainstorm, you're in the middle of a problem solving process
Mm-hmm.
about how the two of you can work together to do that. So
Yeah.
this notion that it's problem solving, it's not querying, right? It's not read only kind of stuff. And I think that's still the mode that a lot of people are in. So it's factually inaccurate, it's wrong. Well, most of the world's knowledge doesn't consist of precise, discrete pieces of information everybody agrees upon. It's
Right.
conceptual and squishy.
Yeah.
That's what these things are good at,
I agree with
not
that
not
100%.
the factual knowledge. Yeah.
All that being said, circling back to schools, what are some of the biggest verticals or highest challenges are you seeing facing when building maybe an implementation plan or convincing? Because you do lots of consulting, so this is an assumption. I hate making assumptions, but I'm assuming you're going in helping schools understand why they should use a product that you could be consulting for that is an AI driven platform. What's the biggest uh, uh, breaking point or biggest hill you have to climb that you're seeing going into schools right now?
Well, I mentioned the emotional reaction
Mm-hmm.
and really some ethical reactions, right? The same sort that really all of us have at some level, and some of that's turning into just abstinence, and so that's hard to break through. But I think the other one is really fundamental to schools and education, and I see this at the higher ed level. I see this in corporate training even. These are not realms that devote or give people a lot of time to step back and think. Um, if you're a K-12 teacher, and I briefly did that, but I wouldn't call myself a teacher. Um, not enough time in the saddle, so to speak, but enough to give me a sense of how overwhelming the daily list can be, and
Right.
how it keeps you from thinking too far ahead. You immediately come into school and you got to be ready for the year. So I think the fundamental thing that I talk with schools about is really sort of the three fundamental pieces of change, which are the same ways that AI learns, right? If you want to be a learning system and learn, and change is fundamentally about learning something new, then you better have a feedback signal, right? I better know what I'm going for and try to measure it. I have to have a way of sharing lessons, whatever lessons people have. I tried it for this purpose, the students got confused here. So there's got to be a real collaboration environment within the school that shares these lessons.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third thing I talk about is really experimentation. And I know that's sometimes a dirty word in evidence-based practice kind of realm. But what we're talking about here with AI doesn't have a background, right? We don't know the evidence about how people best learn this, and the way a learning system has to explore. This is called the explore exploit trade-off in AI. But you first, if you want to change something, have to allow a lot of room for exploration. That could be little micro experiments.
That makes sense. You briefly touched on how uh, how they can prepare and continue to prepare and adopt, but how do you think that we could stay ahead of how do you think teachers and students can stay ahead of learning how to use these products instead of falling behind and have the AI, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like it would be better to be ahead knowing how to use this product instead of being behind constantly trying to catch up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do. I do. Look, I think one of the things about the transient nature of knowledge in this AI realm
Mm-hmm.
is don't try to teach at the transient level of knowledge, right? It shouldn't be about what all the product features are. Sure, teachers have to get far enough to use the tools, okay, right? But next year there's going to be another tool and another set of features and another set of learning objectives. So what I've been focusing on with my clients is trying to take this back to, okay, what are those core principles surrounding AI that in 10 years, 20 years, they're still going to be there because they're kind of fundamental to the information universe. And there are actually a bunch of those.
That's where I was going to ask next. If, since with 30 years experience in this, what are some principles that still exist today that you were working with, 30 years ago?
Yeah, so I mentioned the explore exploit trade off. So just to
Uh-huh.
build on that. So that's fundamental in AI teaching. And it basically says at the beginning, when you're teaching something, you have to let it explore the space of possibilities. You have to give it some room to creatively look around. But as you start to really need it to get something done, you have to actually allow it to play less. It mirrors the way our brains develop, right? There's a lot of play when kids are little, but the older people get, the less malleable their brains become. And that's really nature following that same fundamental principle.
Mm-hmm.
If you try to have that exploit thing done first, right? You try to say get the best short-term answer to short-term performance on some learning objective, then you will necessarily give up the quality of performance because you haven't built those durable skills. Essentially, that play process is where the durability comes in. So that's actually a fundamental principle. Another fundamental principle might be um, things like judgments. Okay, if I'm going to teach about concepts, and there's a lot of teaching about concepts,
Mm-hmm.
concepts have boundaries and ranges of validity, right? So if I'm not teaching students this is when the concept applies and this is when it doesn't, then students never learn what that boundary is.
Right.
Like I learned that from training AI, not from talking to people. So
No,
there's
that
a
makes
lot of
sense.
those concepts.
The
Kind of pedagogical, actually.
When you were talking about that, one of the things I wanted to look at was I watch my favorite podcast on the internet is the All In podcast. I'm not sure if you've ever watched it, but I feel like they're a group of 4 guys that are pretty smart. They've got backgrounds in Google and Facebook and, Uber, some of the companies that have changed, our generation. But they were talking about the new Chat GPT, the preview model. I think it's called O1 preview, I think is what it said on my phone. But it will show you the thought process that GPT is using to come up with the solution to the question or the problem that you're presenting to it. And I think that that'll be interesting to see, because a lot of times I was, well, how are we going to use it to advance critical thinking? But, in this scenario, it can actually help show you the equations that it went through to come up with an answer that could actually increase, how people learn a
Right.
strategic critical thought process.
Yeah, I was talking to an English professor today about this, and just saying, look, and their point was, look, if the students aren't doing this themselves, whatever this is, okay, the essay or something else,
Mm-hmm.
then they're not learning, they're not having that that practice that they need to get good at that skill. So this is the fundamental paradox that we have. Mm-hmm. And I may be straying from your question, but
you're good. I bounced all over the place. My mind's going everywhere, a million miles.
Right, and this is why sometimes we have these conversations that are talking past one another. What really matters in interacting with the AI is what's the sophistication of the user or the operator of the AI, right? If I'm an expert and I'm working with it in my area of expertise, right, it's great. Mm-hmm. Because, I largely know whatever it's spitting out at me, but usually it's about, reminding me of that or, putting it out in 3 minutes where it would have taken me 20, and I take it and I munge it the way I really want it, however that's happening, whether it's a data analysis or coding or whatever else. But if you're a naive user, now that power imbalance is dramatic, and that's the problem. And that's really where I think there has to be a better dialogue between ed tech and the schools. The school's got to say, here's what I want, right? So I'll give you an example because you mentioned O1 Preview. I was playing around with it on just a simple concept judgment game that I had put together for someone. And that I did in O1 previously. And there, the tutory function of the game, it would just spit out everything. Okay, here are all the errors you did, and this is a student, right? There's 15 things here, right? But that's not really the way a tutor should operate. They should be selecting what are the 1 or 2 things I can teach them now and not overwhelm them with feedback. And that preview did better, right? It just put out 1 or 2 things that it cogitated on were the most important. And the judgments were pretty good and quantitatively analyze it, but much better than when it didn't have that feedback.
Yeah, I totally think you're 100% right with that. My assistant, she tells me she hates Chat GPT, and I'm like, I use it for everything. And she's like, I know, I have access to your account, so I use it for absolutely everything. But the thing that I really enjoy about it is it has changed the way I think about the questions that I want to ask. And I'll believe that I have a certain outcome to how the answer should be or what I would like it to be. And it gives you like a debate platform to see if you can come to an understanding of that, if you can guide it the right way. And I feel like if you can guide, GPT to the outcome you want, then maybe there's an opportunity for that to be the answer. But if you absolutely can't get it there, then you need to rethink the process of how you're looking at something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think what it does for me, and partly it's because I'm a writer, is
Hmm.
it helps me pull out what are the tacit pieces of context that I have that I'm not saying. If I go to a person, right, there's certain shared context between us. If I do a work tasking, for
Hmm.
example, right, that I can tell you sort of go generate this project report and know that you kind of have a sense for what that means in our culture. Um, but a lot of times when I'm working with AI, let's say I'm working with it on a curriculum, I give it a specific task, but I don't tell it, here's my pedagogical philosophy, and here's why I think that. And they better know this, but it's not this isn't important. And there's a whole philosophy behind what I'm doing, and it's baked into my intuition as much as anything.
Yeah, I
And a
like
lot
that.
of it is like, in some ways, working with the AI helps me realize, oh, that was a piece of context it needed because I see how it's screwed up here.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I like that. I enjoy learning from it, learning with it, but you can boost your ego with false data, depending on what you're loading into it, for sure. What would be some advice that you would give educators or administrators that are really hesitant in incorporating AI uh, into their teaching methods, and what's some advice you'd give there?
Well, to me, there are certain minimum responsibilities.
Hmm.
Okay, students are using this. They will increasingly not be able to avoid it. I mean, the next version of Microsoft's operating system is going to have AI baked into the OS. Is
Right.
so is so
Apple's
so
already
too
doing it on
so
their
too with
phones.
Apple, right?
Yeah.
Right. So can't be avoided. There are definitely safety issues. There are definitely issues with respect to academic integrity, and you just can't let those slide. We can't do what happened with social media and get around to it someday. Like these kids need to be have it discussed with them while it's really salient and before these bad behaviors or bad practices get baked in. As for the rest, I think there's no magic solution. I feel like these are very customized processes and
Hmm.
necessarily need to be because the culture and the issues at one school are different than at others.
That makes
Um,
sense.
but the biggest part is dialogue to start, um, and and that means not being a little too draconian on the regulations, right? I think what I've seen is the tendency to say, I'm going to wait until there's evidence. And life doesn't provide evidence on fast changing things. That's death,
Right.
right? Because by the time you get evidence, it isn't even
It's
the
too
same
late.
thing anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I like to listen to audiobooks. I'm not a great reader, but Jeff Bezos says that if you've waited to gather more than 70% of the information needed to make a decision, you've already missed the opportunity. So, I've really held on to that. You mentioned the word regulatory, love him or hate him. Elon Musk is a huge voice in the AI community, and he's pushing for stronger regulatory around AI. What's your thoughts on that?
I would very much like stronger regulation of AI. I don't particularly believe Elon Musk is credible a lot of times on these things. Um, because one of the things that having regulation does is it will slow down the top players and let everybody else catch up a little bit.
Right.
So you don't know what to believe there. But in terms of regulation, like even within a school and within a government, the question isn't really what to regulate, right? There are certain harms that can come from the technology that I think all of us want to mitigate. The question is, what's the best way to do it? Because if you tell a student no, uh, you know, they're probably doing it because you said no, right?
Most likely.
Yeah,
I know
and
my
and
kids
that's
are.
yeah, that's just being young, right? That's sort of part of their job at some level is to challenge authority as they're expanding their psyche. Um, but I think in this case, it's you're asking, losing the track of the whole question, but you're basically asking what are the kinds of things you can do to get the ball rolling here.
Yeah.
I think, and it's really just attitude to start. Hey, we're going to try something. I have told schools, and I don't know that anyone has taken me up on this, but I've said bring your students into the problem solving process. Like it should be a powerful experience to say, this is new. We're all trying to figure it out. You can help us. Let's work together. What use of this do you feel helped you learn better? And what use of this do you think didn't and made it tougher?
There's
And let's work
actually
it out together.
there's actually I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Father Leahy last week or maybe the week before, and his school is a school that does this. They bring their students into the decision making process, and
Very empowering.
they started off with an all boys school. Now they have an all girls school and an all boys school, and they've had great response to it. And a lot of those kids go on to be business owners or entrepreneurs because they teach them that from a very early age and allow them to be a part of these decision making processes, which I think is an amazing aspect. The school's been around since like the 70s, I believe. So, but
yeah, I
it's
mean,
starting.
one way to look at it is you can't have creativity without allowing agency.
Right.
You're not going to give students some say. It's very hard to expect them to be creative creatures when they come out.
No, I love that. I love that so much. I ask the same question at the end of every show. And I'm sure MIT has opened up a million doors of opportunities of fascinating people to work with over the years. But how do you leverage your network? And for the young people watching our show, what's some advice you'd give to them on utilizing their network in order to expand and grow in fields that are interesting to them?
It's a really good question because it's one thing I've actually had to rebuild my network entirely. My network was in national security things. Actually, that's what I did for MIT is a whole bunch of government projects. And so building the network in education has been definitely an ongoing process. And look, I would say there's no replacing quality,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have to be a voice that people want to talk to. If you're constantly having to sell what you're saying and saying or wanting to do, let's just call it some kind of action or benefit that you want to grow to yourself, then you're going to have to show people stuff, right?
Right.
So a lot of what I preach at the college level, especially, but I think it applies equally well in high school. And I wouldn't be surprised if colleges go this route in terms of demanding it on applications, is the notion of portfolio. I'm going to school. If I'm going to come out of here, it isn't my grades, right? Grades are great, makes mom and dad happy.
Mm-hmm.
But the colleges can't tell the difference. But too many people have high grades. They can tell the difference with quality work. And increasingly, that might be work that you are showing how you've worked with AI to come up with something better. But it may not be. The point is that it is those accomplishments, it's those competencies that are going to start to matter a lot more. And so students have to start thinking that way, like not just the artist in the crowd, but what is my portfolio that I want to show off?
Right.
And I think that attitude is something that can get us past this cheating wall.
No, I like that a lot.
Students have to value what they're generating inherently for themselves as something they need.
No, that's all really good. That's and like they said, that's the main reason we do this podcast is because I have a million questions and I want to learn from people smarter than me. So obviously when my team stumbled across your LinkedIn profile, which I love LinkedIn, they brought it to my attention like, hey, we're diving into AI and you had 30 years experience in it. So you should have a conversation about it.
So
and thank you for being patient, coming on the show with us. We did have some technical and personal problems getting the show lined up, but that's life and you've been patient. So thank you very much for it. But if somebody else wanted to get a hold of you, if they wanted to bring you in, do some consulting for their schools, how would they get a hold of you? How would they go about that?
Well, the easiest thing is to go to my website, which is timdasey.com. It's DASEY,
Mm-hmm.
or, find me on LinkedIn. And then the third is my email, which is tim@timdasey.com. So,
well, Tim, we'll make sure to put all of those in the video descriptions for anybody watching. We do have a lot of young entrepreneurs. All of them, for the most part, are focused on education. And that's why I love doing this, is because the people that I get to bring on the show ultimately have the idea of greater good in mind. So it's fun. And Tim, thank you so much for joining us. And I look forward to having a conversation with you again in the future.
Thanks, Kyle. I enjoyed it.
We'll talk soon.